Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and hello to our European attendees. And thanks for joining us for today's webinar presented by Ziflow. My name is Mike Peterball, and I'll be one of your hosts today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Attendee lines are muted, and that's just to cut down on the background noise like leaf blowers and barking dogs, or in my case, 3 homeschooled children. Our session today is being recorded, and a copy will be sent out after we finish up today. And we'll take questions at the end of today's presentation, but please feel free to enter them at any time during the course of the webinar in the Zoom interface. And if I can catch them as they're entered on the slide that I'm on, I'll see if I can take them. If not, like I said, we'll take them toward the end. Okay, let's meet our hosts. As I mentioned, I'm one of them. My name is Mike Peterball, and I'm the CMO here at Ziflow. And I'm joined today by Will Liu, our VP of Ops, who is also responsible for our customer success organization.
Hi, excited to have everyone on the webinar today.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Ziflow, just a quick background. We are singularly focused on innovating in the online proofing space, and that's helping agencies and brands and creative teams the world over solve their most pressing review and approval challenges. If this is something that you and your team are looking for help for, especially in these new days, you can find more information on our website at www.ziflow.com. Before we get started, and I think it goes without saying that the world has changed quite a bit in the last 2 weeks, much more than in the 30 days or so since we originally scheduled this webinar. Many of you on the call today are probably settling into week 2 or 3 of their work from home career. Interestingly enough, Ziflow has always been a 100% remote work from home company. And hopefully we can help ease that transition for you. Our CEO, who has spent the last 15 years leading remote teams, put together a couple of quick blog posts over the last week on both managing remote teams, as well as some of the tools and processes we use here at Ziflow to keep a remote team engaged and productive. My one piece of feedback or advice would be that, it definitely is a test of a company's culture, but you can definitely lean into it and make it part of your culture, actually. So I think that's one of the reasons that we've been able to excel as a company, is that we do have a really strong culture, even as a remote working team. So you can find those blog posts on our blog at www.ziflow.com/blog. There's some really helpful tips in there in those posts for sure. So if this is all something new to you, which we're going to take a quick poll on in just a minute, I'd like to find out how new this is to all of us. If this is new to you, remote working, managing a remote team now all of a sudden, there's some really good tips in those 2 blog posts. Okay, why we're all here today. As I mentioned, we originally scheduled this webinar about a month ago, before the most widespread quarantines and containment strategies hit. But obviously, it's just as important today. It's never been more important, actually, to keep engaged and aligned with team members. And specifically, for the creative production process, hallway conversations that might have helped move projects along are no longer possible. And managing a team's output might not be as seamless as it was before. So today we're going to cover some topics that'll include best practices for kicking off projects right from the start, the right way from the start, I should say, managing the creative pipeline, keeping the velocity of the project pipeline moving, and then also role control. The idea of like collaborating effectively, but also securely. So let's get into it. Before we get started, just a quick poll. Let's see if I can pull this off. How many of you, I want to ask, just take a quick poll, and maybe what we'll do is I'll launch the poll now. I want to know how many of you are now working from home as a new normal for the first time. Maybe you've done it occasionally on Mondays or Tuesdays, but now that you're doing it full time, how many of this is absolutely just like new to our attendees? Or maybe put another way, how many of you on the call are still trying to figure out the right background for your Zoom calls? Looks like we got a pretty even split between yes and no. That it's actually no, more. It feels like more people are accustomed to working remotely than not, which is good. It's not necessarily a terrible shock to the system. It definitely is, for many organizations and many people. I've got a lot of colleagues who have worked in more of the traditional office setting, and I can tell you they spent most of last week figuring out, microphones and video cameras and, getting power strips for all the things that they need to plug in now. So it looks like we're in pretty good shape here as an attendee list. That's great to know. So let's move on. Let's click here. All right. If you've been on our webinars before, you know that we like to always kind of start with the why. And that's probably never been more obvious as to why we're talking about today's topic, but there are other underlying areas as to why working with remote team members can be a challenge. Real quick, if you've been on a webinar before, you may have seen a slide like this before. We reference this data quite a bit here at Ziflow. In 2019, we commissioned a survey where we looked at the challenges that creative marketers are faced with. And cut to the chase, we saw three main themes rise to the top: content, collaborators, and compliance. So let's just jump into those really quickly. No surprise, the volume of creative content work is pushing teams to a limit to where they can barely produce effectively as is. This is before you throw in now the remote working concept or aspect into the mix. So as you can see, 60% of those surveyed last year were managing 4 or more projects weekly. A third of the overall survey respondents were managing 6 or more projects weekly. So you can get an idea that this is a challenge when you start to mix in a new remote working kind of paradigm. And these projects, now that you're managing 4 or 6 projects, these projects have even more collaborators, and this is the people providing feedback, guidance, approvals. There's more of these collaborators than ever before, and the methods of providing feedback really haven't kind of kept up with this trend, which is impacting timelines every day. This is really the crux of today's webinar. Your creative projects already have more stakeholders and collaborators than ever before. What happens when you take them out of the typical walls of the office? And really this rolls up into what I like to call this crescendo around compliance. More content, more voices, and now more potentially restrictions. And again, we're seeing that those who are subject to compliance requirements are still relying, I should say, on tools that can drag an audit out. Email, paper-based notes and feedback, sticky notes. Again, some of these things that just kind of now aren't really even possible in the setting of remote working. So let's roll into our best practices, and let's kick off with kicking off. This is all probably goes without saying, but if you're inconsistent around the steps to kick off a project, it would be pretty hard to then go back and streamline your processes in a time of need. And I think that a lot of us would consider this being in a time of need of wanting to really scrutinize our processes and making sure that we can stay aligned and making sure that we can stay productive. I think too often there's false starts, and this is what we hear from our customers, is there's false starts as team members are waiting on assets to get the project actually started, and I kind of use air quotes with actually started. There's also often confusion as to who is going to be involved with the project, and when they are included, how they're notified. So it's one thing to create your roster of collaborators, but it's also another thing to be consistent about how we're notifying them. And a term a customer used the other day, which I thought was really interesting and really resonated with me. She said she was using Ziflow to avoid information asymmetries. And information asymmetries is when one team member or group is working with a different set of information, in this case, versions or feedback, most importantly, than other groups. So that when there's information asymmetry, that can really create unnecessary pain in the review process, leading to unnecessary versions, missed approvals, missed non-approvals, rejections, or like change requests. So this is a really, really big deal to just kind of stop and think about how you can kick off the project the right way from the beginning. And again, this is the thing you have to think about now in this new paradigm is these hallway conversations these reminders of, when you see someone in the break room or, walking by their desk every day on the way to the restroom, they're not going to be able to necessarily happen. And we're going to talk about information overload in a little bit, because, some people may think, oh, it's just as easy as sending a Slack message. And we're going to talk about that as well. So one of the best practices, and this is what really why I wanted to have Will on the calls, because he's got such great experience with this, and the other best practices as well. One of the best practices that we like to suggest to our customers is to utilize intake forms. Now, we have this as a product offering within Ziflow, but even outside of the Ziflow context, if you have the ability to craft this on your own, using a cloud-based file share like Dropbox or Google Drive and some automation, the idea of intake forms can be a tremendous help when working with remote teams. They're great for cutting down in the lag time between assets being made available, again, using air quotes, and project kickoff. And set up properly, when integrated with workflow in the back end, you can bypass what I like to call that single point of failure of a project manager's inbox. So if you are a creative, or if you are the project manager and you're sending this off to be initiated by some other team member, and that team member's inbox is overflowing, even though your assets are ready to go and everyone's ready to get started, because it hasn't been properly, grabbed and kicked off, you're just literally just wasting time. And outside of the remote working context, if your creative process includes external team members like clients or partners, this is a great way to streamline how you work with them as well. So intake forms is something that we've really talked probably to every one of our enterprise clients about how they can leverage this with not only their partners and their clients, but also their internal customers, like other business units that may be requiring creative. Well, I know you have a lot of experience with this, and you probably deal with talking about intake forms at least a handful of times a week. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would actually take a step further back and say the best practice here really is to streamline your project and improve kickoff process. Intake forms is a way to do it. Intake forms is a great way to do it because it's a concept everyone readily understands and they can attach additional information. But there's definitely multiple ways that you can really kick off your proof, your project, or your asset review process. A couple of different ways that we've seen is integrating your project management tool with asset management or cloud storage system. For example, here at Ziflow, we have a concept called Zybots, or a feature called Zybots. And Zybots will actually allow you to connect your proofing engine with Google Drive or Dropbox. So rather than needing to fill out an intake form, rather than needing to email the file, you simply upload it to a specific folder in Google Drive or Dropbox, and that can automatically kick off the proof. I think for me here is the key efficiency is streamlining that initial kickoff process, whether that's through an intake form, whether that's through a connection with a digital asset management system, whether that's through a connection to your cloud storage array, or using something like Zybots. That's where we see a lot of inefficiencies. Even in the best case scenario, we've seen this add a couple hours. If you're doing it the old fashioned way of shooting off an email or sending a Slack message, you have to catch them while they're checking Slack or checking Teams. You have to catch them while they're in their inbox. And that's in a best case scenario before there's screaming kids, homeschooled kids, multiple partners working together. So by streamlining that process, you take out another point of inefficiency or point of failure. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Like I said, through intake forms, through connections to your asset management systems, or simply by connecting it to where you're already uploading your work, like Google Drive or Dropbox.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think that, and kind of talking about like what your workflow is. Let's dig into that a little bit, and digging into the workflow aspect a little bit more can be a really tremendous benefit for your remote teams, and specifically by automating, what you can within that workflow. So one of the best practices that we like to talk about is pre-wiring, in effect, your routing roles and timelines, and tying those to your intake form. So kind of going back to the intake form concept really quickly, you immediately take away a lot of the management overhead associated with a creative project. We're going to talk about that concept a few times more in this webinar, the idea of management overhead. And really, this is maybe a fancy way of just saying, all of the kind of the manual checks and statuses and reminders and prodding and pokes that you have to do as either a creative or a project and production manager to get these projects completed. And we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna talk a little bit more about that management overhead aspect throughout basically the rest of this webinar. If your workflow provider is flexible like Ziflow is, and we'll talk about that later too, you can alter these as needed for specific types of projects. For example, video can have a different workflow than, say, large format print or strictly digital types of campaigns.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah, sorry, well, can I ask if there's anything you wanted to add there?
yeah, I was gonna say a really important point here is the consistency of the workflow is really critical, especially now with remote teams or with everyone working remotely, to stop proofs from really getting ahead of themselves. And what I mean by getting ahead of themselves is where one group reviews it before another group has gotten a chance to. I think the most typical scenario I see here is people going, "Hey, has this person reviewed it yet?" Because they don't want to look at it too soon. And in a normal world, you can just pop your head up and you can go, "Hey, Mike, have you taken a look at it yet?" And if Mike says no, then you don't need, then you're gonna wait for Mike to complete. Now with everyone remote in different locations, that gets more difficult, and you can create additional time in your review cycle if proofs end up getting ahead of themselves. If your copy editor reviews it before a subject matter expert, if a designer approves it before copy gets in there, things like that can be really impactful and add a lot of time to your review process or create unnecessary versioning. So establishing consistency of your workflow process, that's key, really remote or not, in making sure that things don't loop back and forth because people are getting in there too soon or people are approving it assuming someone else has already taken a look at it. But especially as we get remote now, where you can't just pop your head up or walk over to someone's desk, making sure that proofs don't get ahead of themselves and that they're notifying the right people at the right time becomes even more critical. And that all comes down to making sure your workflows are set up correctly with the right triggers and the right reviewers in the right stages.
I think that's a great segue into the next topic that we're going to cover, which is managing the creative pipeline. And this is really less about the end product, the creative, but it's more about the process that goes into that creative produce. And I think we'll just touch on a few really important aspects of not letting the proof get ahead of itself. The management overhead associated with trying to find out where something sits in the process. This is an area that I think is amplified when it comes to working with remote and, quite frankly, distant team members. I think that's a key concept we haven't really pushed on yet, as this doesn't always apply to only team members in the same cities, people that you used to work with in the same office. Now you're just in different suburbs or neighborhoods of the same city. This is also a real challenge when working across time zones and countries. Something that we have a lot of experience with here at Ziflow. It's really easy to lose 12 hours of timeline if you're working with team members in other countries and you didn't get a chance to get a status update from them, or if they didn't update the project management app by the end of their day. Given the volume of projects that creative teams are managing, which we talked about earlier, it's not always reasonable to expect project management apps to be up to date with daily updates. So this is a really big deal of being able to manage the creative pipeline without a ton of manual, I would say, overhead. Which brings us to our first best practice, which is seems kind of straightforward, but our first best practice here is for helping to manage a creative pipeline in a remote setting, and that's the use of visual indicators to get a quick heads-up display view into project process. That old joke, I think you've probably seen a million variations on this meme of this meeting could have been an email. Well, like kind of what Will was saying earlier, that Slack message or email you sent asking for an update could have easily have been just a mouse click or two with being able to check in and get information from a visual indicator. And this is really about trying to be efficient when the discussions you need to have live and allowing team members to kind of keep working in their highly productive states and times. So chasing team members is just a really low value activity and a huge time sink. And not only does it take you as the production or project manager out of your workflow, you know, the Slack you're going to send, or, you know, the real quick email you're going to send is going to take someone else out of their workflow. So if you can have this, you know, just be present in the application or the tool you're using, leverage that as a best practice, because, you know, you really want to, now that, you know, everyone's working from home, everyone's kind of get their workflow down. You know, Will mentioned it, you know, trying to homeschool some kids here and there. If you don't have help, it's a real challenge. So you want to try and keep the disruptions to a minimum. And quite frankly, you know, chasing someone for just a quick status update, hey, did you make your comments? Do you have any feedback? That's a disruption. And that's something that you definitely want to avoid. Well, I know that you work a lot with our clients on just like streamlining like the communication aspect within Ziflow. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is one of those things where I say set it as a standard, set it as a best practice as soon as you can. It's one of the things that I make sure to point out to every client every time we look at the details page. Once you establish that habit or that muscle memory of checking the visual indicators or the progress bar, that really eliminates a lot of the unnecessary back and forth that goes on. I think one of the biggest culture shocks when people are transitioning to remote work is there's this constant worry about whether it looks like you're working, whether your team members are working, whether someone's there or not. And I've really seen and heard this lead to over communication where team members are constantly sending out or asking for status updates. And that takes away from actually doing the work at hand. If I'm constantly saying, hey, this is the latest status of the proof, or if I'm constantly giving someone an update about what I did to the proof, that becomes work for the sake of work. And you're taking away time that you could be reviewing the proof, providing your feedback, or generating a new version. So that over communication really creates a massive inefficiency and time delay when it comes to executing the projects. And that's why I always train clients, even before all of this, that this progress bar, this indicator, should just become a habit. This should be something that you look at as you're looking at the proof. This should be something that you check when you receive the email. This should be something that you're constantly looking at, because the visual indicators are a great way to let you know what's going on without you needing to chase for status updates or to send status updates. It gives you detail on who's opened it, who's commented on it, who's made decisions on it, where bottlenecks may be. It doesn't eliminate the need to follow up with someone, because you may have someone, like in this screenshot, Mike, who hasn't opened the proof that you need to chase after. But rather than chasing after everyone, it helps you focus on what you need to focus on. So this is why I always say, let's establish this as a standard and a best practice to begin with, and make sure your entire team understands when and how to use these visual indicators.
I can't believe I used a screenshot where I was the one who hadn't opened the proof. That was pretty silly of me. Our next best practice, thanks, Will. Our next best practice is around keeping remote teams moving and really keeping the projects moving through the pipeline. And for a project manager or someone who is responsible for managing team members' capacity, knowing what's next in the process is just as important, or probably more important at some point, than knowing where it is currently in the process. As we talked about before, the management overhead of project management, the reminders, notifications, stage progressions, all of that should be automated where you can. In a remote setting, the time lost, this is something that Will just covered expertly. In a remote setting, the time lost to doing that manually can absolutely grind a project to a standstill. Also related to keeping projects moving is a recommendation that we make all the time to our customers to constantly challenge the notion. And Will, I want to have you jump in on this, because I know this is something that you have helped people build into their workflow. Something that I think is important to kind of keep the projects moving is to challenge the notion internally that all stages and collaborators are needed for each new version of creative being reviewed. This sounds maybe like a technical review and approval process point, it kind of is, but it's also one that can unlock a ton of free time for people. I think it's really important, especially when including remote team members into those workflows. If they don't need to be included, there's probably other high value work they can be doing and being productive on. But yeah, Will, I mean, if you want to add anything to that, because I know this is one of those kind of strategic, ROI things that our customers, when they realize that they can do this, they get a lot of value out of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and people have heard me say this before in previous webinars, I think the devil is always in the details, especially when it comes to workflows. Each workflow is really unique to a specific company and how they handle their current processes. But I think there's always a couple of things that you can really look on. When you follow the life cycle of a route, most people build their workflow with the assumption that you're gonna get the perfect pass that first time. So a lot of times when I'm sitting down and working and building a workflow with a client, they take it all the way from A to Z. So they build out their stages as if each stage is going to approve it and as if they're going to approve it from the first version. That never happens. That would be the best case scenario, but almost always you're going to have a couple of different rounds of review. So I always like to layer in the questions, okay, what happens if they say changes are required here? What happens from there? So for each stage, that's actually the question I pose when I'm building a workflow for a client. After we go through stage one, I understand where it's going once it's approved. What happens if stage one says changes are required? What happens if stage two says changes are required? When does it loop back and create a new version? And should those people look at it again? So those are definitely some of the questions that I like to ask as we're building a workflow. These things, the workflows are really dependent on your specific needs and your specific business. I'd be more than happy to, I always like making this offer on every webinar. If anyone of the attendees would like a personal workflow review session, I'd be more than happy to do those with you. So we can really hammer out and find out the right workflow for you. But like I said, the top question you should always ask is not what happens when it gets approved, but what happens if changes are required at this stage or the next stage or the stage after that, so you understand how to handle it through all versions.
Thanks, Will. That was great. Now maybe one that's not as obvious, or one that was not as obvious. Let's move on to one that may be overly obvious, and that's deadlines and reminders. And this is, I put it as a best practice. Maybe you're thinking this is an obvious best practice, but maybe one you'd be surprised to learn that we talk about quite a bit still is around deadlines and reminders. In an office setting, this might be easier done, or maybe it's better to take these done, have these done as hallway conversations, or like a daily status meeting or stand-up meeting. In a remote setting, it's absolutely critical to have well-defined deadlines and reminders set up. And again, this sounds obvious, but if you add up all the amounts of time spent on waiting for team members to engage or comment, it's pretty significant. So automating these are key. And I think obviously now when we're talking about a remote setting, helping people to, helping remind people what they've got responsibility for. And we're going to talk about roles in just a little bit. This is a big one, but yeah, something that we talk about practically every day. From a best practice standpoint, set a deadline. I mean, just set a deadline, pad the date if you have to. I think that's probably Will's number one recommendation when he set these things up with clients is pad the date. That's fine, but just have a deadline. So hallway combos, they don't really exist. So you're gonna have to account for these in other ways. And when we use them consistently, you can deadlines can actually help identify bottlenecks over time. If time sinks are happening in the same part of the process every time, you can then go back and refine your workflows. So there's a little bit more ROI than just delivering the projects on time over time. It's also finding out maybe where your bottlenecks are. And then that obviously will, pay for itself like an annuity with each new workflow update that you do. All right, into which sounds because it rhymes. This is really about collaborating efficiently and securely as well. Role responsibilities are always important, but when teams go remote and also include external stakeholders like customers, clients, partners, I think the importance of roles is amplified. subject matter experts, brand managers, compliance team members, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you need to start thinking about who's going to be involved in your workflow and what kind of what you want to give them as part of the process. Really, roles are important to consider here because, you know, who is being asked to comment versus comment and approve. And you have to ask yourself, you know, also, how secure does this project need to be? And that kind of graduates into roles-based access. So let's get into a couple of best practices. I think the best practice, you know, when you set up, you know, roles and responsibilities, and you know, when you add people or groups to your review and approval process, I think you want to be specific. You want to let your team members know what's expected of them. So you have to ask yourself first, does your current process make it easy to identify access, roles, and contributions? In a remote setting, again, like I said, it's absolutely key to be able to manage who can view, comment, and provide decisions. You know, stages could be left hung if no one knows what their role is, like who is supposed to make the decision for a stage to progress to the next stage. You know, your project could just sit languishing for, you know, days, which might as well be months in this regard, if no one knew what their specific responsibility was. Having roles really does accelerate the overall workflow, because, you know, if someone knows that it's their role to make the decision to progress a stage, again, we're not going to have that time lag. If you want to go next level, you can create review groups and also assign roles by group. So examples would this be like the design group, the copywriting group, clients group, maybe just the brand sign-off group. But I think definitely having roles and groups, but having, you know, even with groups, having roles assigned to those groups is really important. So yeah, the best practice for here is just to be as specific as possible when you're, you know, including people or groups in the review process. A second best practice, which we're talking about quite a bit more over the last few weeks, is the ability to lock down your proofs. Now, we're kind of being very specific now about creative assets in the review and approval process, talking about proofs now. But when your project absolutely has to be limited to trusted team members, you definitely want to have a paradigm which allows the sharing of proofs outside of the original review team, which is sometimes necessary, but it allows you to manage that sharing. And this is really helpful for organizations with compliance requirements of who saw what when, who provided which approval when, and it really provides an extra layer of confidence and security for your creative work. You know, there are, you know, for those agency personas on the call today, I'm sure that you've maybe come across a situation where there was the potential for a new campaign to get leaked because someone was added to a proof or someone shared a link maybe to a PDF on Dropbox. You know, that there are definitely ways to avoid that. And I would say in a remote setting, when everyone's remote and, you know, everyone's going to be notified via email and, you know, maybe an online proofing system like Ziflow of new creative, and that's where the review and approval is going to happen. Being able to lock down proofs is really, really important. All right. Thank you for hanging in there with us so far. I want to reward you all with a real-world demo. Will is going to walk us through some of the concepts that we talked about earlier today and show you how it actually manifests itself in Ziflow. So Will, I'm going to go ahead and stop share. I'm going to turn the controls over to you.
Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, guys. And one of the things that I really thought about before this webinar is what's the most important things to show given the new paradigm that the world's in. And I think the ability to really get a handle on where your projects and your assets are is the most important thing to understand now, and how you can do that in Ziflow. So I really want to focus this on this demonstration on some of the tracking tools that are actually available to you within the system. We've done other webinars on the best way to set up and configure your workflow. We've done other webinars on how to use the intake forms. So wanted to really focus this demonstration on how you can actually use Ziflow for tracking. The number one area that I teach people within Ziflow on how to get really the best bang for their buck tracking wise is in the dashboard. The dashboard is, if you're not familiar with it, is really your personalized feed of everything that's going on within Ziflow. So each reviewer's dashboard is personalized to them. What I see on mine is going to be different than what Mike sees on his because it's based off of my role and my permissions. But a couple of things here is there's actually two concepts within a Ziflow dashboard. We have the concept of filters and we have the concept of views. Now, it might sound like there's a small difference, but this becomes critical when you're trying to focus in on specific elements. And the filters control which proofs display on your dashboard. So when I'm taking a look at this list, the filters control what's showing up on that list. So within my filters, you'll be able to define really anything. A really popular filter that I always like to show people first off the bat is how you can see all proofs that are late. So the proof status filter becomes really key. So here I can actually build a quick filter and say proof status is late. Now that shows me all the proofs that have been flagged as late. You can tell that I use this one a lot because I've actually favorited this one, but you can drill down this one even further. You can do things like proof status is late. You can look for this by specific owner. You can look for this by specific reviewer. You can look for this by specific brand, client, or project. So depending on how you want to construct your filters, this gives you a really great top level view into the proofs that you're looking for. So filters to me serve two purposes. It helps me get to the proof that I'm trying to find faster, but I also like to think of it as runtime reporting. So if I want to get a quick visual update of the current status of my proof, I can do that through the filters. So I can apply one by client, I can apply one by brand, I can apply one by project manager, owner, or reviewer, whatever I want to set my filters for. Another concept that really gets overlooked is views. So while filters control which rows or proofs show up in this proof list, views actually allow you to control which columns of information are displayed on your dashboard. This becomes really critical, especially if you want visual indicators of what's going on at a glance. So the two that I always recommend, I'm just gonna reset my filters real quick. But the two views I always recommend, or the two columns of information I always recommend adding to your dashboard is going to be stages. So here I can actually take stages, apply that, and last activity. Now this becomes really meaningful information. By applying stages, I can actually see from a top level what stage my proof's currently in and whether it's in progress, approved, changes required, or hasn't even started yet. So at a quick glance, I can see where the stages are. I can also see when the last activity has occurred. So I know if this proof has been touched in the last day, the last week, the last hour. I can see all that information directly within my dashboard. Again, this eliminates that over communication where I was talking about. Now I don't need to email Mike and say, hey Mike, when's the last time you checked out that proof? I can see whether it's in a specific stage and I can see when that last activity is. And if you need to drill down further, you can actually expand that all directly from the dashboard itself and get more details down to the specific reviewer and into that stage itself. So now you get a very simple way to get those visual indicators that cut down on tracking down feedback, cut down on what we like to call proof management time, which is a time where you're trying to get updates on the proof or where you're trying to actively route the proof, and you can focus in on what you really need to focus in on. So a couple of things just to recap on the dashboard where I think is critical is applying the filters and saving the filters that are key to you, and then constructing the right views for you. You may not care about when it was created and you can remove that. You may not care about who the owner is and you can remove that, but you may care about stages in the last activity so you can add that. So you can personalize these views based off of what you want to see within your dashboard itself. The next thing is really drilling down into the proof level. So the dashboard is really your macro views. It gives you a high level summary of what's going on, but sometimes you're going to need that detail. And that's where the proof details page becomes really critical. We've talked about the progress bar already. We let you see who S has been sent the file, O opened it, C commented on it, and D submitted their decision. So right away, if it's in green, you know they've been sent the file. If the O is in green, they've opened it. If it's in gray, they haven't actioned it. So visual indicators, again, will let you see where the proof is and what still needs to be actioned on and who to follow up with. But a couple of additional beneficial things that you can do within the details as well is don't underestimate the activity log. I use the activity log a ton. I'm a part of, at this point, I can't even count how many accounts I'm a part of. I'm a part of our Ziflow corporate account, but I'm also a part of dozens of client accounts where clients are sharing proofs with me to give me feedback. A lot of times really just drilling into the activity is helpful for me because I can see comments here, I can see deadlines here, I can see actions here, and at a quick glance I know what I've missed, what I need to catch up on. I can always dive into the proof when I need to by clicking the open proof button, but the activity to me is a really helpful way to catch up on what the quote unquote latest news is on this proof. So I'm always constantly checking the activity on the proof details page and seeing, okay, when did they open it? Did they add their comments to it yet? What comments did they make? So the activity is a great summary list for me to see what's going on within the proof itself. You can really subscribe to the activity by setting email notifications for digest, so a daily digest or hourly digest. If you're a part of as many proofs as I am, even summary notifications can get a lot sometimes. So for the ones that I don't subscribe to, I'm really checking in on the activity to see what I missed before I jump into the proof itself. So really big fan, really top recommendation for me is scan through the activity because that gives you a nice digest or summary view, especially if you don't have that email notification set up. And finally, one of the top things that I think gets overlooked is insights and data. This is analytics that happen in the background, especially as we may be in this for the long haul as companies, businesses are transitioning to remote. You're going to want to find as many efficiencies as you can, and you're going to want to identify as many bottlenecks as you can. There really isn't anything that you need to do to create insights within Ziflow. All of this is happening in the background since we're collecting the data on your proofs itself. But insights is really something I recommend people take a look at periodically to see if they can identify a pattern or a trend. The reason that insights become so powerful is you can define a lot of different things here. You can define your time range, and they'll let you know how many versions were created in that time range, how many got completed. This is all dummy data, so I'm creating a lot of proofs, but I don't complete them. So my insights maybe don't reflect the most accurate real world example, but the insights will show you how many versions were created, how many proofs were completed. Most importantly, it's got to show you the average number of versions to get that approval and the average turnaround time and how many of those are late. These data points are really where you can start identifying your bottlenecks and your inefficiencies, because not only can you define your time range, the filter concept comes back again. So here I can start applying filters. Maybe I'm looking at my insights by asset type. So are digital projects taking longer than static projects? Are video productions taking longer than digital projects? So you may want to look at your insights by asset type. You may want to look at them by brand, project, job, or client. Or a really typical one is actually taking a look at it by owner. So is there a project manager that is really efficient and gets their average versions much lower than the rest, or average turnaround time much lower than the rest? And can I glean insight from that? So if I can see that Mike is consistently getting his projects turned around faster, there's probably an observation that I want to get from Mike. So where the insights become powerful is not just on the raw insights themselves, but when you start slicing and dicing those insights with the same filters that you can apply on your dashboard. These are how you're looking at your proofs to begin with. So it's probably how you want to start reporting in, doing your analytics on the proofs as well to see, okay, what's taking longer and what's happening faster. And those are really kind of the core areas I want to focus the demonstration portion of those webinars. Like I said, there are a ton more we can go into, especially with our best practices around intake forms and automated workflows. But given the transition of everyone working remotely, I want to focus this on how you can get the most meaningful tracking and data from Ziflow. But if anyone has any questions on any of the other areas, we'd definitely be happy to cover this on the webinar as well.
All right, thank you, Will. Appreciate that. Let me go back to my screen, share and present. All right. So again, and as Will mentioned, please, if you haven't already, if you have questions about other areas, about how we might help with your review and approval process, you can enter them in the Q&A portion of the Zoom interface, or you can always respond to our colleague, whoever reaches out to you with a recording of today's webinar. Please feel free to respond, and we'd love to set up some time with you to talk about your review and approval process and how we might help. So let's go into key takeaways before we get into the Q&A. So the key takeaways from today, collaborating with remote and external teams, it obviously is going to require a little bit more planning and thought when it comes to the review and approval process. That's definitely something that you should just be thinking about right away. Starting the project off the right way will save you valuable compounding time, hours, weeks on the back end. So it's important to consider how you're kicking off the projects. One thing that Will talked about is when you start to look at insights and how to get better. That's going to be one of the big I would say outcomes of this new kind of paradigm, hopefully temporary paradigm of work from home. You're going to find efficiencies that you can then bake into your regular processes. And that's one of the takeaways here is save the Zoom and Slack messages for really substantive stuff. Automate the overhead where you can. Automate that overhead where you can. And there are best practices to follow when it comes to sharing with remote and external team members. So it's not just working in the process, but also how you actually share that work as well. I think that's definitely a key takeaway we wanted you to come away with today. Let's go ahead and get into the Q&A. I see that we've got a few questions in the Q&A interface. Let me just go grab those really quick. If you'd like to see a demo, I just went ahead and added our URL. If you want to request a demo of how Ziflow and to see how Ziflow could help you specifically, please visit ziflow.com/demo, and we'd love to walk you through it. Okay, so I've got a few questions here. Can you give an example of, I think, well, we talked about this a little bit, Will, but if you want to give an example, can you give an example of how skipping stages would help me speed up a project?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most typical example we see is a lot of review processes are broken up into a couple of different stages. The most consistent one I see is you have a copy review and you have a design review. So a lot of times after the copy review team has approved it, they don't need to take a look at it again because the designers aren't changing the copy. So what we see a lot of times is the copy approves it, moves on to the design stage. Designers say changes are required, for instance, and then they go back and they make those changes. Copy hasn't changed in this example, so there's no point in sending that proof over to the copy team again just to wait for them to hit approved. By setting up skip stages, we can automatically drag that approval that copy did on the previous version forward, skip them, and jump directly into the design team, which is the one that asked for those changes. So those are really good. That's a really good example of when skipping can save time, because in this example, all you're doing is you're waiting for copy to hit the approve button again because copy hasn't changed. So if you were to bypass them and skip directly to design, those are hours you can get back on the project.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of one of those things that, this new paradigm, if you're forced to kind of really scrutinize your processes, that one change, that one new capability, like Will said, will just save hours upon hours. And that compounds across all those projects that marketers are being asked to manage these days. That's a great one. Here's a good one. I may have either scared or misled some people when I talked about, working across time zones. How do you keep deadlines straight when they cross time zones? It's a good one, Will.
Yeah, that's actually the nice thing. Ziflow does that automatically for you. So whether you're a user or a guest, what happens in the background is Ziflow will actually automatically detect your time zone based off of your browser settings. So nothing for you to do there. This all happens in the background based off of your browser. But when I access approve, it's going to see that I'm based in Los Angeles. So it's going to see that I am in Pacific time. And then I can update my profile to have my time zone as Pacific time. So now when it's sending me my deadline reminders, when it's showing me my deadline, it's got to reflect those time zones for me. So what's great is I don't need to try to manage or balance the time zones. Ziflow in the background is automatically going to update and pull those based off of the user's actual location.
That's great. Let's see. The last question we have is, how do you integrate Monday with Ziflow? Oh, I think, Will, on one of your screens, you were showing that we have an integration with Monday.com. We have an integration with Monday.com. It's based on the Zybot technology that Will had talked about earlier, which automates the passing of information from Ziflow to Monday. So you can actually update your status requests, new comments, decisions, really any of the kind of the posted information that you create within Ziflow can be sent to Monday. So I'll grab your email address. Looks like Amanda asked that question, and I'll make sure you get some more information on that integration. At a higher level, from an integration standpoint of Ziflow, if you're asking yourself the same question now, but it's a different app you use, Ziflow can be integrated with practically most modern SaaS applications. We've got a very well documented API, and we leverage webhooks as well. So we're able to send pretty easily and efficiently information to other applications to keep them updated. So if you're a project manager or production manager where that's an absolute requirement, we can definitely meet those needs. Good question. Good question. We also got a request for the recording of the webinar. Yes, we will definitely take care of that. Everyone who was on the call today will receive a copy, no problem. And I'll just re-extend that offer that if you, after getting your copy of the presentation today, you'd like to learn more, you'd like to maybe see how your workflow could be improved for this kind of new world of work, we're more than happy to hop on a call with you. So with that, I think I will say our goodbyes and thank everyone for their time today. And we'll see you next month for next month's webinar. Goodbye, everybody.